So, does forage type have an impact on the methane emissions of cattle? Why do we care? So, the industry, especially in recent years, is under scrutiny as a whole, but especially the grazing sectors of production. Consumers see that agriculture is about 9% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, even though that's much lower than the other sectors like transportation, and automatically want change. The zero emissions target that a lot of consumers push towards means that we need some form of mitigation strategies, especially with such a rapidly growing population, that beef will be essential to help feeding in the coming years. So this is a graphic to give you an idea of how the methane works in cattle. It's a natural byproduct of fermentation, and it's needed for proper rumen function. When microbial fermentation happens, volatile fatty acids are made and they're used for the animal, and the leftovers of that process are CO2 and H2, which are then converted to methane by the methanogens and eructated into the atmosphere by the famous cow burps. To the right, the graph shows that carbon dioxide is fixed by plants in photosynthesis. This carbon is then converted to methane after the ruminants eat the plants and then is expelled out again. This methane can live in the atmosphere for about 9 to 12 years before it's ever broken back down into CO2. So, one of the first things to consider when you're lowering this methane from grazing operations is to consider using C3 grasses instead of your C4 grasses. Your C4 grasses are higher in lignin and fiber, meaning they're harder to digest, and therefore they stay in the rumen longer, leading to more methane production overall. And C3s, on the other hand, are also usually higher in protein, and they may actually boost your animal performance. Your C3 plants are your cool season grasses. So in Georgia, we would think of these as like tall fescue or a perennial ryegrass. And your C4 are your warm season grasses. Another common one here would be your Bermuda. And these are different because they carry out different forms of photosynthesis, and their cell structure is also a little bit different. As you can see in this figure, your C3 plant is not as tightly packed as your C4 plant, and the C4 plant being more rigid, it makes it harder to digest, and then therefore stays in the rumen longer as well. So, another important factor when thinking about forage type, is it a legume? Legumes increase your forage quality and digestibility. They increase your protein, they increase dry matter intake, they increase your ruminant passage rate, reduce fiber content, and increase overall animal performance. These are all really good when it comes down to looking at methane. So, even if you're grazing a warm season C4 pasture, you could supplement or even plant some legumes in with the already established pasture to give it that mixture that may bring down your methane production, while also actually increasing your animal's performance and growth. In Georgia, two of the common sources that we see most often are clover and alfalfa. So, one of the biggest things, no matter your type of forage, you want to avoid grazing or harvesting at full maturity. The more mature the plant gets, the more the quality and digestibility are driven down. Thus, it stays in the rumen longer, increasing that fermentation time. One of the things that you can do, especially with your smaller herd sizes, is rotational grazing. It can be a really good way to ensure the quality and maturity of your pasture stays where you want it to be. And it also helps to make sure that you aren't overgrazing. If you graze your forage too low, you can actually kill it off, and it won't have the same quality as it did before. And it can actually be just as harmful as letting the grass mature too much as far as depleting out the good nutrients. The graph I have here shows the stages of maturity and how the actual cell contents compared to the cell wall percentage changes over time. You want more of your cell content, so at the lower stage of maturity, you're going to have 65% cell contents with 35% of your cell walls. This is where you would want to be. You want the more cell contents compared to, on the higher stage of maturity, having the 40% cell contents and the 60% cell walls. That 60% cell walls is just going to mean that there's a lot more lignin and harder fiber for the animal to break down, resulting in, again, higher methane production. So, in conclusion, forage type actually does matter, and we can decrease our methane production by being aware of this and our other factors like maturity when feeding our animals. Mitigation strategies are extremely important even for grazing-based operations. They're not as common and there may not be as many options, but there are some and we should push to have those implemented. To help cut down that methane, you can add in some cool season grasses, a legume or two, or even just avoid grazing grasses or harvesting grasses for hay that have reached their maturity. Even just implementing one of these strategies into your operation can make a pretty big difference.